Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Fatema and I'm a psychological careers coach, and I help psychology students to find an aligned route towards their psychology career that suits them. And today we're going to be talking about particular roles that actually some psychology students that are experienced in mental health can actually get into to really help their career progression. Some of these roles are very well known within the psychology field, but some of them are quite new, so it will be really helpful for a lot of people that have perhaps just graduated or are looking to get into some other kinds of roles for more work experience to really know about these roles so they can plan a route for themselves. Now, there are two particular things that I want to really say before we move into this video, only because I think it's really important as a psychology careers coach to let you guys know exactly what these roles are and who they're actually for, because a lot of the times we can come out of university and feel like we can start applying for some of the really kind of well experienced roles and then become really disheartened when we get to that point and nobody is accepting us for any kind of interview process. So it's always helpful to kind of know like where you stand and what kind of experience you actually need to be able to get into some of these experienced mental health roles. Now, a lot of these roles that I'm going to be talking about today do require you to do some kind of training to actually get into the role and then practice as a qualified practitioner. These roles are not accredited. I think bar one, most of them are qualified roles, but they're not accredited. And having an accreditation and being qualified in the field of psychology are two different separate things. So it's really important to know that. So the two things that I really want to share with you is, the first thing is that these roles are for people who have experience. So if you have been in a support worker role for a significant amount of time, or a healthcare worker role, or a role where you are gaining mental health experience, then these roles will be for you to kind of look into to support your career progression. If you have come out of university where you have gained a master's and you have been in academia for quite some time, again, these roles might not be applicable to you, because although you have a lot of academia experience, it's really important to get work experience in the field of psychology. It's not like you can just come out with a bunch of knowledge about theory and then move into a practitioner role. They do require you to have the experience where you're working on the front line with a variety of different patients in order to get into some of these roles. The other thing that I just want to say is that if you are a student that's just coming out of psychology academia and you have spent your years kind of gaining the experience that you need, then these roles might be easier for you to obtain. However, some of the roles that I am going to be talking about today, the employers do typically look for people that have been in some kind of full-time paid experience in order to get these roles. I think a lot of people out there do get some of the roles through like voluntary work and things like that, but it's usually that they've got some kind of paid experience alongside of that that has really been showing how they are able to transfer their skills into their new role that they want to go into. So just keep that in mind, that if you do find it really difficult to get into these roles, it's important not to rush yourself into these roles. I know that we all want a really great pay and we want that progression to be smooth and quick. But in the field of psychology, we know that there's no fast track route, and we know that it's not as easy as just applying for a role and hoping that we'll get onto the training, doing the training, becoming accredited, and then having a wonderful career as a psychology practitioner. It's a lot more kind of intensive in the sense where you have to go backwards and forwards with your experience, with your training, and so on, to then get into a role where you feel really kind of aligned with what you want to do. The second thing that I just want to mention is that the roles that I'm going to be talking about today, it's really important to note that they are great careers within themselves. A lot of people will talk about these roles as stepping stone roles, which they are not really built to be. The reason why people talk about them as stepping stone roles is because some people do abuse the process of using these roles to get like the experience that they need, so then they can then quickly move on to something else. I've known people that have started the training for some of these roles and then very quickly left the training and then moved into something like a clinical doctorate or something like that. Although everybody has their own motive and agenda in life, I think it's really important to go into roles that you feel passionate about. Because if you do go into a role that's funded and that provides you with the training and then you leave halfway, it might be that you are taking the chance away from somebody else that actually would like to be in that role and would like to make the most of it. So really make sure that you're going into these roles because you want to actually become qualified in something that you want to pursue as an actual career for at least a couple of years before you might then move on to something else. A lot of these roles do also have high turnover rates. Like generally in the career of psychology, you'll find that there's something called a high turnover rate for some of these roles, and that's because, again, people are just moving into other things rather than establishing themselves in these particular roles. And that isn't always the fault of the actual person that's doing that. Sometimes the career progression opportunities are quite limited and people want to go on to bigger and better things, so that's completely understandable. But equally, we've got to stop thinking about these roles as stepping stone roles and just think about them as careers within themselves, and really establishing ourselves in the roles so that when we are in them, we can sort of move towards, like, for example, the management route. There are some services out there that don't require you to be a psychologist or a CBT therapist or some kind of accredited practitioner in order to move up the management scale. So just think about that, and just think about really getting to know the services that you're in and establishing yourself in one place, and really getting to know your team before you think about moving on to any other kind of role. So I think I'm just going to leave that there and really get into the roles so you guys can really see which roles are best for you. Let's get into it. So the first training role that I want to talk about is the PWP role, which is something that you probably hear a lot about now. It's been around for about 15 years, probably a bit longer now, and it was introduced as part of the IAPT initiative. Now, IAPT basically stands for Improving Access to Psychological Therapies, and what that means is that before PWPs were actually introduced, if a person wanted any kind of psychological therapies or support, they could either go privately where they're seen immediately, or if they wanted to do it within the NHS, they would have to wait at least 18 months to be able to be seen by a psychological practitioner. Now, that was a very long period of time, especially for people that just needed some kind of brief input. And so that is where the initiative for psychological therapies actually came from, and that's where the PWP role was actually built and introduced. Now, PWPs predominantly work in the NHS, where they work within a community service, primary care services, where they are working with patients in the community that have experienced some level of anxiety and depression. PWPs do not work with complex mental health disorders. Although they might assess people with complex mental health disorders, they go on to treat people with mild to moderate levels of anxiety and depression. And again, these can be just general people within the community like me and you that are experiencing any kind of mental health difficulties. Now, the point of a PWP is not to necessarily give a diagnosis or to change perhaps the situation that they're in, but it's to help them understand how they can manage their mental health alongside a difficult situation that a person might be in. So they very much work with the principles of CBT, where they challenge a person's thoughts, feelings and behaviours to really help them to understand how they can manage their mental health. Now, in order to get onto the training for a PWP, you can either have a BSc psychology degree or a master's and significant mental health experience. It's typically that it's not like you can move from a BSc psychology degree to then a master's to then a PWP qualification. They actually prefer people who have like more mental health experience rather than lots of qualifications. And that is because there are actually PWP qualifications out there that don't require you to have a BSc psychology degree or any kind of degree. And what that means is that basically the PWP qualification can be taken in two different ways. Well, actually three different ways, but let's talk about the first two. So the first two, you can do it as an undergraduate or a postgraduate. An undergraduate would be for someone that doesn't have a BSc psychology degree, but the service are quite happy to take someone with a depth and breadth of experience in mental health and then provide them with an undergraduate certificate in advanced psychological therapies, which is what the certificate is called. Now, the other way to do it is to do it through a level 7 postgraduate certification. So the undergraduate is a level 6 and the postgraduate certificate is not any different to the undergrad. The only difference is that they just like to keep an eye on who is undergrad and who is postgrad, so that when they are assessing them against criteria for the course, they are able to be fair with the people that they assess. Now at the end of the actual training you will receive the certificate, and whether your certificate says undergraduate or postgraduate, the actual work that you do in service is the exact same. There are some services that might specify must have a postgraduate certificate rather than an undergrad, but I've really never known anyone to be discriminated heavily for this, and actually as long as you've got the qualification, they are happy to recruit you and to offer you the interview to actually kind of see if you are right for their service. The other way that you can go into this, the third way, is to do it through a master's course. So you get universities out there like Ulster University where they actually have the PWP course attached to the end of a master's course. I believe the master's course is called Clinical Applied Psychology Masters, and if you have a look at that course, especially at Ulster University, and of course I'll link it in the description box below, you can see how they do the typical kind of like modules for a master's in clinical psychology, and then they have the PWP qualification at the end of it. So this also gives you the opportunity to become qualified at the end of your academic studies and then go into a job straight away where you're earning like a pretty good salary. The final way of getting the PWP qualification is to actually do it at the end of a BSc psychology degree. There are some 4-year psychology degrees out there where you can actually do your BSc psychology degree and then you have 1 year of applied psychology at the end. And what that applied psychology year is basically about is your PWP qualification. And again, it might have that undergraduate kind of title for the certificate that you have, but again it doesn't make a difference when you are looking to work in the actual field of PWPing. The only difference between these particular things is that obviously the ones that you can do undergraduate and postgraduate certificates in, they can be funded on the NHS, and then with the ones that you do through university, you would obviously be either funding it yourself if you're doing the masters, or if you've got student finance, you'd be using that for the masters and for the BSc psychology degree with the PWP qualification at the end of it. So I guess the easiest way to do the PWP qualification is to do it with a university course where they're providing you with the PWP qualification at the end, or to do it as a funded route through the NHS. Now you can typically find these kind of PWP qualification training jobs on NHS jobs websites, or you can actually go through the individual kind of mental health local services to see if they've got any kind of openings. Some services, like for example, you've got Nuffield Health and you've also got like a charity called Mind that do have separate kind of training for PWP, and the funding is joint with the NHS, so it's still that you would be funded to do it, but at the end of it you would just be working for perhaps a service that isn't NHS based. But it doesn't really make a difference in the general scheme of things about, you know, the training that you get and how you're going about it and doing it. It would be just like doing it within the NHS, so it's not something that you need to worry about too much. The only thing that I would say is that wherever you get the job for a trainee PWP is to always read the contract and to make sure that the contract aligns with what you think it's meant to be and what you have, you know, ideas about how you want to train. The reason why I say this is because some people are now finding that their contracts are saying that you have to do the training and then you have to stay with the service for a number of years before you can move on. And I believe this has got to do with the point that I made at the start of this video where we talked about the high turnover rate, is that they're protecting their services to make sure that people that they fund and that they give so much money to are actually staying in the service. I've also heard a rumour, and I don't know if this is true, but I have heard that if you do leave the course before it's finished to go on to something else, or because you're not deferring, for example, you're actually leaving it completely, then it might be that you have to pay a percentage of the course back to the service or to the NHS to kind of compensate them for the time and kind of space that they've given you. So it's really important that you check these things in your contract before you really go for this job, because it might be that it's not the right job for you. And then if you do want to leave, you might be ending up with kind of like expenses that you have to pay. The career progressions for PWPs is that you can move actually up into a senior PWP post, and you can then go further in some services as a lead PWP that looks after the whole low intensity team. So like I said, there are some routes into management, but typically what happens is that in some of the services, especially in London, you find that it's usually CBT therapists and accredited practitioners that actually take some of those roles. But again, for senior PWPs, like, you don't need the accreditation. You can go from a PWP to then a senior PWP relatively quickly, which gives you an increase in pay and also responsibilities as well. The next role that I want to talk about today is the Children's Wellbeing Practitioner role. Now, the Children's Wellbeing Practitioner role is very similar to the PWP role, however, you don't work with adults, you work with children instead. So you predominantly work with children and adolescents alongside their parents, their guardians, their carers, and anybody that's kind of in charge or looking after them. And the approach that the CWPs take is that they are trying to support prevention for adverse mental health difficulties in the future. So they're really kind of teaching children with the principles of CBT again to really help them to manage their mental health. And they take into consideration the kind of values of the families and the carers and the guardians that these children live with to make sure that they're kind of having like a humanistic, holistic care for that actual child. Again, CWPs are actually based within the community. There's actually a centre called the Anna Freud National Centre for Children based here in London that CWPs are very heavily connected to, and I believe that a lot of the CWP posts are predominantly around the London and outside of kind of the near London areas, but you can get some of the kind of areas that do the CWP posts as well. I guess you've just got to make sure that you set up NHS jobs alerts to make sure that again you're finding these roles quickly and applying for them as soon as they come out. The thing with some of these roles is that as soon as the roles come out, they can go really quickly because of the demand. Sometimes for like 1 or 2 jobs in a service, you'll get like over 400 or 500 applicants. So again, this is why it's really important that you only go for this job if you really want to do it. CWPs are also based within the community where they work in community centres, and sometimes they will go to GP surgeries or they will work in centre for children and for youth to really support them with their mental health. At times it might be that they are going to some schools and things like that just to share the information and to do some outreach work. But again, it's very much that they are focusing on the community areas of kind of children's mental health rather than schools and things like that. The next role that I want to talk about today is the Educational Mental Health Practitioner role, which is again very closely linked to the CWP and PWP role. The difference is that it's actually more connected to the CWP roles where they actually work with again children and adolescents and people that are kind of within the school education system. So what they'll do is they'll be predominantly based within schools and perhaps even colleges to really support students with their mental health. And again, they'll be sharing psychoeducational materials and CBT principles to really help people manage their thoughts, feelings and behaviours to manage any kind of mental health difficulties that they might experience. Again, if you want to read more about the Educational Mental Health Practitioner role, I'll link the link below so you can have a look at exactly what the Educational Mental Health Practitioner role is about. In terms of the PWP, the CWP and the EMHP, they're very same in terms of salary. So when you are training, you typically are on a band 4 salary, which is around 19,000. And then when you qualify, you then move into a band 5 salary, which is around 23,000. Again, it doesn't really matter where you live in the UK. The bands are kind of the same, except if you live in London, where you would get the inner London weighting. Now the cohorts for these roles are all very different. So for example, the PWP cohorts can be throughout the year where they are in September, January, February, some of them even have cohorts in March, and some of them even have cohorts in May. With the CWP, it's very much at the start of the year that they start, so they do like their interviews and things in December, November, and their applications are even a little bit before then, but they actually start their courses at the start of the year around January, and I believe the Educational Mental Health Practitioner role is kind of the same. This is why it's really important to make note of exactly when you are searching for these jobs throughout the year and to set up the NHS jobs alerts for the training roles, so again, whenever you are wanting to kind of apply, they can come up in your inbox and you'll be the first to know. The important thing to know about these roles as well is that you need a CV and personal statement ready. They get filled up very quickly, which means that actually then you need to apply as soon as you see them. So if you set up your NHS jobs alerts, you can get these kind of alerts to your inbox very quickly, and if you've got a personal statement and CV ready, you can apply straight away. The next role that I want to talk about is the Graduate Mental Health Worker role. Now the Graduate Mental Health Worker role was very popular in, I guess, a couple of years ago when it first came out and when it was first introduced. However, throughout the years, you see less and less of the trainee graduate mental health worker roles, and actually there isn't much information out there about them either. Now, the trainee graduate mental health worker role works with a variety of individuals, from children to adults to elderly, in the community again to help them with their mental health. And you'll be working very closely with members of the MDT, such as social workers, care coordinators, nursing staff, GPs, to really help someone manage their mental health. Now, the thing about the trainee graduate mental health worker role is that it gives you a postgraduate certificate at the end. However, it's very unsure as to if the role that you actually have is kind of a qualified role and if it's something that's recognized by lots of places, because it's not very well known like the PWP role, for example. So when you get into it, yeah, it gives you some kind of an opportunity to train and to get more experience. But again, it sounds like the progression routes and things like that are very slim within that particular role. And the other thing is that this role is only really done with one university, which is Middlesex University. And again, you have to apply through NHS jobs to be able to get onto this role. Now, from the research that I've done, it seems that the role is actually coming out around September to December time, and then around January, February is when people actually start their training. But from what I've read, it seems like people that apply for the role are also very, very unsure about what the role actually involves, because there just isn't much information out there on it. So I think unless you actually call them up and speak to them, it's very hard to know more about like what the actual role involves. So I will link some links in the description box below for you to have a look in your own time. Again, these roles are not very well represented out there, and that might be because there aren't very many opportunities for people to train, and maybe the funding in that particular area isn't as great as perhaps for like IAPT. So I guess once I find out more information about this particular role, I will do a separate video on it, but for now, just have a look at the links in the description box to see what information really resonates with you. Another role that I want to talk about today is the Clinical Associate Psychologist role. This is a fairly new role in England, but it has been very well known within the Scotland area. Now, from the research that I've done, it's important to note that we don't confuse them to be the exact same role, because they are different in the sense of how they are kind of trained. For example, the CAAP role appears to be a longer term kind of training course where you are doing like 18 months of training to become a CAAP, and to be a CAP, which is a clinical associate psychologist, you only have to do a year's training of intense modules to then become qualified as a CAP. Now, the other thing is that apparently a CAAP, you can actually become an accredited therapist or an accredited psychologist, I suppose, but as a CAP, again, it doesn't seem to be accredited. It's qualified, but it's not accredited. Now, these roles are particularly aimed for people who are ready, again, for the clinical doctorate training, but have applied for it numerous times and haven't been able to get onto the training. So they have now introduced this separate role. It kind of gives you the same competencies as a clinical psychologist, but obviously you're not doing the research and the thesis work, and you're not also getting that vigorous approach of different kinds of trainings all into like a 3-year period with a clinical CAAP role, for example. Now, the clinical associate psychologist role is a year's worth of training, and there are lots of intense modules that you have to do to be able to work with people within a specialist area. So differently to like the CWP or the PWP or the EMHP, where you are predominantly working with mild to moderate depression with people from a variety of different backgrounds, with a CAP it might be that you're working with a specialist group of patients. For example, if they have difficulties with eating disorders, it might be that you're doing the kind of formulation, assessment, intervention process with those particular patients. The other difference between a CAP and a PWP and a CYP and MHP is that the pay is also considerably more, in the sense where you are doing your training at a band 5 level, and then when you qualify you are able to go into a band 6. So for example, at a band 5 for about 23 to 25,000 you'll be doing your training, and then when you go to a band 6 you could be paid around £30,000 or above, depending on where you live, again in the UK. Another role that I want to talk about today is the associate practitioner role, which is also a fairly new role. Now, the associate practitioner role is different depending on what area of mental health you work in. For example, you can be an associate practitioner in the community, or you can work in psychiatry. And again, it's very much that you aren't just based in one kind of centre like a PWP would be just in the community. You can be placed in different places depending on service that you interview with and apply to. So for example, an associate practitioner would work very closely with members of the MDT, for example, nursing staff, psychiatrists, care coordinators, occupational therapists, to really maintain the well-being and mental health of a patient. Again, you are delivering evidence-based psychoeducational information to patients, and you are working very much on the front line with patients. And it is a great role to get a lot of mental health experience working very closely with clinical psychologists. Now, the important thing is not to get this mixed up with an assistant psychologist role, because they are two completely separate roles and apparently they are seen to be doing two separately different things. However, you can find a lot of overlap in both of the roles. Now, the difference between assistant psychologists and associate practitioners is that assistant psychologists don't typically do a lot of the kind of mobility or personal care or nursing care kind of like healthcare stuff. They're very much situated within a psychology department. However, some of the associate practitioner roles that I've heard about and that I've spoken to can include some of the nursing duties, in which case you would be like based on a ward or kind of a healthcare environment where it's not predominantly just like psychology, it's also other areas of healthcare involved. Again, with these kinds of roles, it really just depends on the service and the funding and when they've got the jobs available, because I guess what they would have is people that are on rolling contracts or that are seconded to their departments or that have fixed term contracts. So it really just depends on when that contract is coming to an end or when someone is leaving for them to then set up an advertisement for a new position. So again, it's really important to either set up NHS jobs alerts or just keep a track of the different kinds of roles out there on a regular basis so that when they do come up, you're able to apply straight away. The final roles that I want to talk about today are some of the sister fields of psychology, and they are kind of like nursing, social work, therapists, which aren't really psychological therapists but still give you a lot of mental health experience. And they can be great roles within themselves that you go into even after being in them. So for example, you have OT assistants, you have speech and language therapists, you have therapy assistants, and you have trainee nursing associate practitioners. And so these aren't directly linked to psychology, but again, these are great roles that you can have a look at with a BSc psychology degree to see if they are roles that you want to go into. Now, with the trainee nursing associate practitioner role, it might be required that you have some kind of nursing qualification, but not always. So it's really important to check the job description and person specifications to make sure that you really meet that essential and desirable criteria. And what I always like to say is that if you have the experience and you meet 50% of any essential or desirable criteria, then the important thing is that you apply and see what happens. But obviously, if you have no experience at all and you are like, well, I got a first in my psychology, or I got a really great grade, like a distinction from my master's, and I don't understand why I'm not being accepted onto jobs, then just note that having a first and also having a distinction award is very different to knowing how to work with patients on the front line in real life. So when it comes to work experience, your grades don't actually matter. What matters when you apply for like clinical doctorates and where they actually want to have a look at your transcripts and things like that, that's when your grades will actually matter. But I think that's the beauty of like the field here in the UK, is that the psychology field doesn't really look so much at grades. Like, they're very much happy to invite people who have 2-2s and that have got a lot of mental health experience rather than like a BSc psychology degree to enter some of these training roles. So I guess that brings us to the end of today's video. I hope you guys found it helpful and it gave you some kind of food for thought as to what you can go out and kind of search for and look at and just kind of get involved in. Of course, if you want to have more of a detailed chat about if any of these roles are right for you, then head over to the description box below, where I share more information about how you can work with me and how we can set out a detailed psych career plan for you so that you know exactly what you're doing over the next couple of years and actually moving towards a solid goal. Again, if you have any questions about anything that I've mentioned in this video, leave me a comment below. Don't forget to give me a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel for more information on psychology careers. I also have some really exciting ways that you can work with me and get involved in the near future. So do follow me on my social media, especially my Instagram, where I am most active, to find out more information about that. I hope you guys have a lovely day. Thank you again for joining me, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!